Modern Ukraine may be the most insane country in the world today. From the president, to the parliament, to the war effort and its cause in general, the only word that truly describes the situation is madness. A Jewish president rules as a dictator, with banned opposition and cancelled elections. Men are dragged off the streets into a war they'll almost certainly die in. New videos of this happening emerge every day. The economy is held together purely by debt to foreign powers, and the hole only grows deeper as the Zelensky government is constantly losing ground on the battlefield and troop desertions rise. The 2023 book The Defeat of the West by French academic Emmanuel Todd describes how modern Ukraine is not really a country, but a centralized structure which is not a state strictly speaking, but a military police organization financed by Washington. Emmanuel Todd is an experienced historian who predicted the fall of the Soviet Union 15 years before it happened. Today, he writes how it's the West, and particularly the United States, that's in the process of a nihilistic, self-inflicted decline. He connects this to how the US took over Ukraine in the 2014 Maidan coup and has been running it into the ground since. I covered this in detail in my previous video on who is truly to blame for the Ukraine war. I find Todd's book, The Defeat of the West, extremely good on the topic of Ukraine, so I'll be quoting it often in this video. In this video, I will comprehensively break down exactly what's going on in modern Ukraine. Hey everyone, before we get started, I wanted to thank you for watching. If you'd like to support this channel and my work, go to my Ko-fi link in the description and become a monthly member. You can also become a member to support me here on YouTube. Either way, all your support counts and helps me to keep bringing you videos. Thank you for your support, and now, back to the video. Since its independence in 1991, Ukraine was plagued by the problems typical of ex-Soviet states: corruption, emigration, low birth rates. What stands out about Ukraine, though, is not only were its problems worse than Russia's, but unlike Russia, it never had a turnaround. Emmanuel Todd writes, "Even more than Russia, Ukraine had failed in its exit from the Soviet system. Between 1991 and 2021, its population had fallen from 52 million inhabitants to 41 million, a drop of more than 20%. Its fertility had fallen even lower than Russia. While Putin was subduing the oligarchs in 2003, nothing of the sort happened in Ukraine." The 2014 Maidan coup made all of Ukraine's problems even worse. The first act of the new parliament was what laid the foundations for the current Russia-Ukraine war. It was the repeal of a 2012 law that had allowed regions of Ukraine to grant official status to minority languages, like Russian, alongside Ukrainian. Imagine being a Russian in eastern Ukraine. Overnight, a coup d'etat overthrew the government you voted for and is now passing laws against you. In response to these events, pro-Russia revolts started all over Ukraine and Russia annexed Crimea. The Maidan government then began an ever larger crackdown on all things Russian across Ukraine. In the government's first elections in May 2014, over half of eastern Ukraine abstained from even participating because they saw the new government as illegitimate. So to call Ukraine a functioning democracy after 2014 is dubious at best. All of this conflict begs the question, what exactly is the Ukrainian government fighting for? What values does it stand for? The Ukrainian government since 2014 has been fighting for a form of civic nationalism that posits Ukrainian identity has nothing to do with genetics or background, but only a civic loyalty to the Ukrainian state. This concept was championed in the 20th century by the Jewish Ukrainian writer Ivan L. Rudnitsky, and is echoed today by pro-NATO historians like Timothy Snyder. This is backed up by statements from Ukrainian government officials. Zan Beleniuk, who is the first black member of the Ukrainian parliament and a member of Zelensky's party, declared, "Anyone who lives in Ukraine, respects its culture, speaks its language, and loves this country is Ukrainian. It doesn't matter what your skin color is or what your origins are." This quote and the idea behind it were widely circulated in Ukrainian media as representing the government's philosophy. In other words, modern Ukrainian nationalism is built on the idea that anyone, even an African, can be Ukrainian. This concept of Ukrainian identity was created in direct opposition to the competing concept that Russians and Ukrainians are brother peoples linked by ethnicity and shared history. Vladimir Putin made the case for Russians and Ukrainians being one people in his famous essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. This understanding comes from the fact that Russians and Ukrainians are very close genetically and linguistically. Both are Slavic, both are Christian, and both have shared history in the common space of ancient Rus. The Zelensky government rejects this, and fitting with its idea of civic nationalism, the head of the Kiev School of Economics and advisor to the president's office, Timofey Milovanov, reported that after the war is over, he wants Ukraine to bring in 10 million new immigrants. For perspective, that's around 1/3 of Ukraine's current population. If the Maidan government had its way, there may very well be a Ukraine in the future with no ethnic Ukrainians. Zelensky has also made comments saying he wants Ukraine to be, and I quote, a big Israel. You are free to interpret that statement as you see fit. As a side note, there are some people who support the Palestinian cause but also support Ukraine. By the end of this video, you'll see why that's utterly ridiculous. Ukraine and Israel are very closely linked. In any case, the most accurate description of Ukraine's cause is George Soros's open society. That means a country with open borders, a civic rather than ethnic identity, neoliberal capitalism, Zionism, and a globalist orientation. All dissenting groups and voices are crushed in pursuit of these goals, and they certainly have been in Ukraine. The Soros Foundation and its supporters openly brag about how much influence they have over Ukraine.
I set up the foundation in Ukraine in 1990. One of the things that the foundation did gave a lot of scholarships, and the maturity of civil society 25 years later is to a large extent the work of the foundation.
It's actually amazing in Ukraine, the new Ukrainian government, the new Ukrainian leadership. Everyone who I know in that group has been touched somehow by open society and by George, like literally. Either people personally got a scholarship or someone, their wife got a scholarship. It's a really remarkable thing.
Part of the logic of this so-called open society is to crush all voices against it, which leads to the next part of this video. So how does the Ukrainian government keep this extremely devastating and unpopular war with Russia going? It's very simple. It resorts to extreme totalitarian measures against its own population. It's not an exaggeration to say that the Zelensky government rules chiefly by violence and terror. Before the war in 2022, Zelensky's party, Servant of the People, held a little over half of the seats in the Ukrainian parliament. When the conflict with Russia began, Zelensky immediately took dictatorial powers and banned all opposition parties. His party, with only half the seats in parliament, seized near total control of the country. This wasn't spontaneous. NATO had put the pieces in place for this years in advance. Despite this war often being framed by Western journalists as a battle between democracy and tyranny, Ukraine at war lacks the very basics of what you could call a democracy. Over a dozen political parties are banned. There is no political representation for all citizens. Its military and government resources come from foreign powers, rather than from its own citizens' taxes. This is a puppet state. So, with dictatorial powers and no opposition, in 2022, Zelensky signed orders creating a so-called unified news policy. This law centralized Ukrainian TV stations and created an information monopoly to broadcast nothing but government propaganda to Ukrainians who couldn't flee the country. In December 2022, Zelensky also signed a law giving the government the ability to shut down any media channel that dissents from the government line. To give an idea of the kind of suppression that independent journalists face in Ukraine, we can look at the case of Gonzalo Lira, an American citizen and journalist. Lira went to Ukraine to report on the war and criticize the Zelensky government. He was quickly arrested by Ukrainian authorities in May 2023 on charges of justifying Russia's actions against Ukraine. While in custody, he claimed to have been tortured, and in January 2024, he died in prison without ever receiving a trial. The fact that the US government had nothing to say about an American citizen being executed without trial shows America's deep complicity in Ukraine. Another key part of Ukraine's totalitarianism is how it mobilizes men for war. You've probably seen the hundreds of videos going viral of men being dragged off the street into kidnap vans. Ukraine has a massive, well-known manpower shortage in its military. This is due to a combination of factors. For one thing, it's fighting a war against a country with a 4 times bigger population. But it's not just that. Ukrainians don't want to fight. Young men flee the country as soon as they can, and polls show that popular support for the war in 2025 is the lowest it's ever been. The Zelensky government's answer to solve this problem is to pull Ukrainian men off the street in kidnapping vans and force them to the front lines. It's worth comparing here the Ukrainian military to the Russian military. According to official figures, including Western intelligence, only about a quarter of the Russian military are conscripts, meaning men forced to fight. The rest are volunteer soldiers. Ukraine is a very different story. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense reported in 2024 that over 66% of the Ukrainian armed forces are conscripts. This explains why it's so common to see videos of Ukrainian men being kidnapped, while such clips never appear from Russia. This challenges the NATO trope that Russians are just slave soldiers forced to the front lines by Putin. That characterization, as it turns out, much more accurately describes Ukraine. One 36-year-old ex-Ukrainian soldier who survived being conscripted reported in an interview with Al Jazeera how little the Ukrainian government cares about the lives of soldiers. There's zero training. They don't care that I won't survive the very first attack. They don't care whether a soldier learns to shoot. They gave me a gun, I shot around in the direction of a target, and they ticked a box next to my name. Emmanuel Todd writes how life has been treated as cheap in Ukraine all the way since 1991. He uses the example of how surrogacy for profit was common before the 2022 war. This is the practice of having a baby for another person. He writes, "Most countries in the European Union banned surrogacy by 2016, but on the eve of the 2022 war, Ukraine was the El Dorado of surrogacy. She held 25% on the world market thanks to very competitive rates. It was, and still is, renting Ukrainian bodies to produce Western children. In Ukraine, this is the synthesis of neoliberalism and Sovietism." The way Western governments have ruthlessly used Ukrainian lives to fight Russia for them can be seen as a continuation of the logic behind surrogacy. That human life isn't seen as sacred by the Ukrainian state, but something cheap to be sold and used. But Ukrainians aren't the only victims of propaganda and totalitarianism. To bolster its domestic and foreign support, NATO leadership in Ukraine have devised a sophisticated propaganda network across social media that also influences Westerners. NATO journalists constantly talk about so-called Russian propaganda, but Ukrainian propaganda is actually far more widespread in the West. Unfortunately, even YouTube isn't safe from this phenomenon. Take the United 24 propaganda outlet. This is a media network created by the Zelensky government in 2022 for the specific purpose of influencing Westerners. You can see here from its channel what kind of content it publishes. What's interesting is that despite YouTube's policy that government-funded media must be designated as such, United 24 has no such government label. Meanwhile, its Russian equivalent, RT, was banned on YouTube and across the entire EU in 2022. This one-sided censorship and vast propaganda network have led to the creation of a popular saying since this war started: Ukraine gets wins on social media, while Russia gets wins on the battlefield. You may have heard the famous story of the Ghost of Kiev, a pilot who single-handedly shot down dozens of Russian fighter jets. Completely fictional. Or the story of the Snake Island soldiers that cursed off a Russian boat and then fought to their death. They actually surrendered and didn't die. There are countless other examples of these fake stories. Despite Ukraine's vast social media network, public opinion in the West is still mixed at best when it comes to supporting Ukraine. People aren't as dumb as NATO was hoping. The economy of modern Ukraine is built on two things: debt to foreign powers and subsidies from foreign powers. It is truly an economy from hell. The 2024 budget approved by Ukraine reported that government revenues would be 56 billion euro, and government expenditures would be 95 billion euro. In other words, Ukraine spends almost double the amount of money that it takes in from domestic revenues. It's estimated that over half of this budget goes purely to the military. One Ukrainian politician, Sergei Rachmanin, said in October 2025 that almost 100% of Ukraine's tax revenue goes to the military. He also reported that the Ukrainian military actually spends much more money than what's shown on paper, meaning the numbers are actually even worse than they look for Ukraine. Civilian sectors such as health and education are extremely underfunded because so much revenue is diverted to the military. Ukraine's GDP to military spending ratio is the highest in the world by far. The latest numbers put it at 35%. The next highest in the world is Israel at 9%. Ukraine's military budget is expected to increase even more in 2026 to 70 billion, mainly increasing to pay the families of soldiers killed every day in the war. The war is a literal death spiral for the Ukrainian government, in that the more Ukrainian soldiers die, the more the government has to pay their families in compensation. Every day the war goes on, the costs for Ukraine only get higher. Ukraine's borrowing is astronomical for its weak economy. Total debt doubled from 95 billion euro in February 2022 to 185 billion euro in July 2025. Ukraine's debt to GDP ratio is projected as 100%, making it one of the highest in the world. Russia's, by comparison, is around 20%. In terms of foreign aid, the Ukrainian government receives tens of billions every year from the United States and the EU in what is essentially welfare. If you live in America or the European Union, these are your tax dollars being taken away. If you think this doesn't affect you as a Westerner, you're kidding yourself. Earlier this year, Trump's so-called Big Beautiful Bill cut billions from American social programs. All the while, Trump continues to allow giant weapon shipments to Ukraine. And yes, as of December 2025, American military aid does continue to Ukraine. It comes from the 2024 aid bill passed under Biden, which Trump has continued, despite his election promise to end America's wars. In Germany, Chancellor Friedrich Merz declared that Germany's welfare state could no longer be afforded. That same week, he announced 9 billion euro annually for Ukraine. NATO governments are literally taking from their own people's pocket to give it to Zelensky's regime. But despite all of this, Ukraine always needs more. At the NATO-led Ramstein summit in October 2025, Ukraine's defense minister Denis Shmyhal asked NATO countries to hand over at least 0.25% of their GDP each to finance Ukraine.
I would also like to add a few words on our overall defense needs for 2026. We estimate them at $120 billion. Ukraine will cover half, 60 billion, from our national resources. We are asking partners to join us in covering the other half. The most effective path to meet this need is our European and non-European partners to dedicate no less than 0.25% of their GDP to military support for Ukraine.
Across the board, the Ukrainian government's war costs are rising far faster than its revenues. Every year, the war will get more expensive, and the demand on the Ukrainian and Western populations will get worse. And then there's the other elephant in the room, the problem of corruption. Untold amounts of money simply goes into the pockets of corrupt Ukrainian officials. including and especially Zelensky's inner circle. In November 2025, a massive corruption scandal broke out involving Zelensky's top associates. Timur Mindich, Zelensky's right-hand man who played a massive role in building his political career, was implicated for stealing over $100 million in public funds meant to be spent on Ukrainian energy facilities. Mindich and his associate Alexander Zuckerman ran a money laundering operation where they received millions in kickbacks from public funds. Mindich used the stolen money to fund his own lavish lifestyle, including buying a golden toilet. It's important to note that Mindich and Zuckerman are both Jews with Israeli citizenship, and both men fled to Israel just hours before the scandal was exposed to the public. In other words, the government tipped them off and gave them time to flee. This should shut down anyone saying, well, at least the corruption was exposed, except the people masterminding it were allowed to escape. Also, the fact that Israel protects these criminals once again shows the deep connection between Israel and the Ukrainian government. Israel and the Maidan government are the same entity. Andrei Yermak, head of the office of the president and close friend of Zelensky, many have called him Zelensky's enforcer, also resigned due to this scandal and may end up in prison himself. That is, if he also doesn't flee to Israel. Given Zelensky's proximity to all of the people involved in this case, it's only a matter of time before Zelensky himself is implicated. I suspect this corruption scandal is only the tip of the iceberg. In a normal country, this would have been the downfall of the entire regime. But as we know, Ukraine isn't a normal government. The policy of pro-Ukraine elites so far has been to simply ignore Ukraine's corruption and pretend it doesn't exist. But that denial of reality doesn't change Ukraine's dire financial situation. Modern Ukraine should thus be seen as one giant militarized colony. No economy, only military. Massive budget deficits, huge borrowing, extreme dependence on foreign money, civilian sectors squeezed. It is the economy from hell. One of the defining elements of Adolf Hitler's National Socialist Party was its opposition to Jewish power in Germany. In fact, anti-Semitism was, and is, completely pivotal to National Socialist ideology. One of the key Third Reich policies were the Nuremberg Laws, which racially separated Germans and Jews into two separate legal categories. It's extremely strange at first glance, then, to see self-described Nazis in Ukraine fighting on behalf of a Jewish dictator. Adolf Hitler would not be pleased with these Nazis, to say the least. So what's going on here? Western journalists have answered this question. They've reported thoroughly how Ukrainian nationalists are not actually National Socialists. A 2022 article by Monash University stated, "Anti-Semitism has little resonance even among more extreme Ukrainian nationalist elements." Emmanuel Todd also noticed this phenomenon, and came to the conclusion that Azov and other Ukrainian nationalists are not Nazis. They're just extremist Russophobes. In Azov's mythology, Russians, not Jews, are to blame for all of Ukraine's woes since the dawn of time. Therefore, Russian language, culture, history, and identity must be wiped out for the glory of Ukraine. This is what Russia means when it says it is denazifying Ukraine. It wants to remove the elements of Ukrainian leadership that literally want to genocide all Russians within Ukraine's borders. The term denazify isn't really correct though, since Ukrainian nationalists are just Russophobes and not ideological Nazis. Another core plank of National Socialist ideology is autarky. This is the idea that a nation should be able to sustain its own economy without any reliance on foreign countries. As we know, that's the polar opposite of modern Ukraine, which is completely dependent on foreign powers for its existence. While Azov and other ultra-nationalist elements think they're using NATO and Zelensky to gain power, the opposite is what's actually occurring. Zelensky and NATO have used these troops as useful idiots to carry out their own goals. As we know with how the US funded ISIS, Western leadership has no problem arming violent extremists as long as they carry out Washington's agenda. In 2025 though, Ukraine's nationalists who thought fighting for a Jewish dictator was a good idea are all dead or dying. In this war, Vladimir Putin and the Russian government are defending Russia's national interest from what they see as an existential threat from Ukraine and NATO. They're also fighting what could be called a civilizational war. Nowhere is this more clear than on the issues of mass immigration and LGBT. The Russian government has said it wants to fix its low birth rate through domestic births, not through immigration. It also bans the LGBT movement as a terrorist network, and the government sponsors traditional families. It's rare to find policies like this in any NATO country today. In The Defeat of the West, Emmanuel Todd describes Russia as an authoritarian democracy. That is, it's a democracy that actually represents the majority will of the Russian people, even when that will is considered authoritarian. He contrasts this to the West's liberal oligarchy, a system where governments treat their own populations as problems to be managed rather than citizens to be obeyed. In a liberal oligarchy, it doesn't matter what the people want. Democracy exists there only as a facade to serve a globalist agenda. All of the major conflicts in the world at the moment, Israel versus Palestine, Russia versus Ukraine, are linked. The US government is the backer of Israel and Ukraine, and these two entities themselves work closely together. In June 2025, Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb used spies to sneak into Russia's borders and unleash drones to attack its nuclear-capable aircraft. Just 12 days later, this exact same tactic was used by Israel to attack Iran's air defenses before Israel and the United States bombed the country. These two operations were almost surely planned by the exact same people. Ukraine and Israel are the same entity. They are the same front of the same war for the future of the world. It's crucial to understand this. There are some people who support Palestine but are also pro-Ukraine, and this is an extremely naive position. Israel and Ukraine are led by the same mafia. Remember, Zelensky said he wants Ukraine to be a big Israel. The world Russia is fighting for will clearly benefit itself, but it will also benefit any country that wants freedom from Western globalism. Even now, many European countries are questioning why exactly they should support Ukraine. Germany has been in recession for over 3 years, which is directly downstream from the EU sanctions on Russian energy. Countries like Hungary and Slovakia greatly benefit from partnership with Russia, which is why they refuse to follow any EU sanctions. This quote from Emmanuel Todd about the Ukrainian government is just so powerful I had to include it here in full. We know Clausewitz's formula. War is only the simple continuation of politics by other means. It hardly applies to the analysis of the Ukrainian cause. The war here is its own goal. It gives meaning to a nation where politics does not exist. It is the incapacity of the Ukrainian nation-state to be born and to find its basis. Neo-Nazism is not the right concept to qualify the inability of the Ukrainian nation-state to exist, to understand the self-destruction of Ukrainian industry, to describe the regression of concrete Ukrainian culture and life, so dependent on the Russian language. At the heart of the general policy of the Ukrainian government, we sense a sense of vertigo, a flight towards the precipice, a destructive impulse towards what is, without considering what could be. The concept that comes to mind is that of nihilism. In essence, Emmanuel Todd is making the case that the Ukrainian cause is self-destructive and nihilistic. All I would personally add to this is that while the Ukrainian government's cause is absolutely self-destructive and nihilistic for the Ukrainian people, there is a sick logic to all of this from the Washington and Tel Aviv perspective. The continuation of this war ties Russia down, limiting their actions in other theaters of the world like the Middle East. The 2019 Rand Corporation paper, Extending Russia, explains this sick logic extensively. This strategy benefits a few Zionist oligarchs while coming at the expense of common Ukrainians and Western taxpayers. This war and the destruction of the Ukrainian people will go down in history as a lesson that when you put your people's fate in the hands of Washington, and by extension, Israel, you've signed your own death warrant. This lesson needs to be understood by people across the world, and especially people in Europe, now more than ever. Fortunately, Russia gets closer every day to finally bringing this disastrous saga to an end. This has been Pax, and thank you so much for watching. Please leave a comment letting me know your thoughts on all this. If you'd like to support this channel, the best way you can do it is by becoming a member on Ko-fi. As always, I will see you in the next video.